In this video, I'm going to add a new web service endpoint to our user controller, and that web service endpoint will be used to get a single address record that belongs to the user. And in this video, I'll go a little bit faster than usually because everything that I'm going to do in this video, you already know how to do, and we have discussed it a few times. So I'm going to paste a new function which will be annotated with get mapping. Let me actually format this source code first. Okay, so this method is called get user address, and it will need to accept HTTP GET request, and it will expect user ID to be provided after the /users, and we will have user ID /addresses, and then it will expect the address ID, the public address ID by which it will query the record from the addresses database table, and it can produce application JSON and XML. Okay, so this method get user address will make use of address ID, and it will use addresses service, which we will need to auto-wire now to get that address. And once we have the address DTO, we will again use model mapper to map information from the address DTO to the addresses REST data type, and it will be a single record, not a list, but a single address record that will be returned back. So what we need to do now, we will need to auto-wire the addresses service into our REST controller. So we have an example how to auto-wire user service. Let's auto-wire address service like this. Okay, now let's scroll down and see if everything is okay. We have an underlining, and this is because we still need to implement the get address method inside of the addresses service. So let's go into address service and now add this get address method and provide its implementation. So I will go to address service, and I will now add a new method here, which is to get address, and it will return address DTO. Now if I go to user controller, this underlining should go away. Okay, so we have the get address method inside of our interface. Now we need to go to address service implementation and implement this method. So I will add unimplemented methods for now. This is an empty method, and I will provide its implementation now. I will copy the method body and I'll paste its implementation. So what we have here is get address should return back address DTO, and we first define an empty return value, and then we're returning it. But before returning it, we will use address repository, which we have already auto-wired to this address service, and we will need to create a new method there to find by address ID. We will need to use query methods to find a record by a field name, and we will use that public ID. And if the address entity is not empty, if something was found and returned, we will then use model mapper to map everything inside of the address entity to new object of address DTO data type, and then we will return that value. So now we need to go inside of the address repository and create this method find address by ID. Let's do that. So I'll go to address repository, and inside of it I will need to provide a new method. So that's going to return a single record address entity, and it will need to accept a public ID, and that's going to be string address ID this time, like this. So it's going to find a record by address ID. So if I go inside of the address entity class, I should be able to find the address ID class field in that address entity. If I go in, this is the field that the record will be queried by. Okay, so let's go to the address service. Let's save this. Now we have the find by address ID method implemented, and I think this is it. We should be able to run our application and send a HTTP request and see how it works. So let's go to the user controller, and one more time look at the URL that we will need to use to be able to trigger this method and get user by address ID. Okay, so let's run this application. It started successfully. So now let's go to our Postman. And here we have list of addresses that we have received in our previous video. Our access token should still be active. So I will copy this address ID now, and I will go to the URL and I will add it after the addresses. So I will copy this ID and replace it with this, which makes our URL match the pattern that we're expecting. users/user ID /addresses and then address ID /addresses and then address ID. And we should get back address record, which is of type billing. So let's send this one. And here we go. We get back a response, which is only a single address record with a billing type. Now let's remove this ID and get list of all addresses and send this request. And we have shipping and billing. Now let's get a shipping one. So I'll copy its ID, go back to my URL. After the addresses, I'll add / and then address ID. I'll send it. And now I have only shipping. Okay, so it works, and we now know how to get user details that contains addresses, and we now know how to get list of addresses only without the user details, and we can query a single address that belongs to the user by its address ID.